The great doors of the throne hall burst open before the guards could announce anyone, and every head in the room turned at once. Ren Sorensen stood in the doorway with her hands shaking, soot still on her sleeves from the kitchen fires, and she did not know yet that this single moment would break something inside her that no apology could ever fully mend. She had been summoned. That was all anyone told her. A royal guard had pulled her away from washing pots only an hour earlier, and said the new king wished to see her, and she had assumed it was a mistake, the kind of mistake that happens when a name gets confused in a busy castle. Kings did not summon kitchen girls. Kings did not even know kitchen girls existed. But Kellen Ashford knew. The moment she stepped past the threshold, he felt it slam into his chest like a fist closing around his heart. The scent hit him first, warm and sweet and impossibly familiar, though he had never smelled it before in his life. Every wolf inside that hall straightened at once, because they all understood what was happening, even before their new king said a single word. The air itself seemed to hum with recognition. Kellen gripped the arms of his throne so hard the wood groaned. He had been crowned only that morning. The weight of the crown was still unfamiliar on his brow, still pressing down with a heaviness he had not yet learned to carry, and now this. Now his wolf was rising inside him, pushing against his ribs, screaming one word, over and over, in a language older than speech. Mate, mate, mate. He looked at her properly for the first time. She was young, maybe 20, with dark hair pulled back in a hasty knot, and flour dusted across one cheek, where she must have wiped her face with a dirty hand. Her dress was plain wool, patched at the elbow. She was, by every measure the court used, nothing. And yet, his entire body was straining toward her, as if she were the only solid thing in a world made of smoke. Ren felt it too. She did not understand what it was, only that the room had gone strange and tight, that the king on the throne was staring at her, the way a starving man might stare at bread, and that something low in her chest had begun to ache in a way she had never felt before. She took an instinctive step back, and the guard behind her placed a firm hand on her shoulder to stop her retreat. "Your Majesty," the guard said, "this is the girl, Ren Sorensen, kitchen staff, 3rd floor." A murmur swept through the assembled nobles. Council members exchanged glances. Somewhere near the front, a woman in deep burgundy robes pressed her lips into a thin, disapproving line. This was Lady Priscilla Vane, head of the Royal Council, and she had spent the last 3 years quietly steering the kingdom toward an alliance marriage that would finally end the border conflicts with the northern Pax. She had not planned for this. Nobody had planned for this. Kellen rose from the throne. He did not remember deciding to stand. His body simply moved, drawn forward by a pull he had no name for yet, though every instinct told him exactly what it meant. He descended the steps slowly, and the hall fell into a silence so complete that Ren could hear her own heartbeat hammering in her ears. When he stopped in front of her, he was close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his eyes, could see the way his jaw was clenched as if he were fighting something. His voice, when it came, was rough and low. "You feel it too," he said. It was not a question. Ren's mouth had gone dry. "Feel what, Your Majesty?" He did not answer. Instead, he reached out, almost against his own will, and let his fingers brush the back of her hand. The contact sent a jolt through both of them, sharp and electric, and Ren gasped before she could stop herself. Somewhere behind Kellen, she heard Lady Vane draw in a hissing breath. "Mate," Kellen said quietly, so quietly that only she could hear it. "You are my mate." The word landed on Ren like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of confusion and disbelief through every part of her. She had grown up hearing stories about fated mates, the way every wolf child did, tales of 2 souls bound together by fate itself, an unbreakable thread that no distance or time could sever. She had never once imagined that thread might lead to her, and certainly never to a king. For one breathless moment, something like hope flickered in her chest. She looked up into his face and saw, briefly, not a king but a young man, who looked as stunned and overwhelmed as she felt. Perhaps, she thought, this strange and frightening thing could also be something wonderful. Then she saw Lady Vane step forward, and the hope in her chest curdled into dread before anyone had spoken a single word. "Your Majesty," Lady Vane said, her voice carrying easily through the silent hall. A word, if you please. In private. Kellen hesitated. His hand was still near Ren's, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his skin, and some part of him did not want to move away from her, not even for a moment. But he was a king now, crowned only hours ago, and a king could not ignore his counsel on his very first day. He gave Ren a look she could not quite interpret, something between apology and promise, and then he turned and followed Lady Vane toward a side chamber, his guards falling into step behind him. Ren stood alone in the middle of the throne hall, surrounded by nobles who stared at her as though she were an animal that had wandered in from the forest. She heard whispers behind raised hands. She heard someone say the word servant, with obvious distaste, as though the word itself were an insult. She wrapped her arms around herself and waited, because there was nothing else to do, and because some foolish, hopeful part of her still believed that when Kellen returned, everything would be different. Behind the heavy oak door of the side chamber, that hope was already being dismantled piece by piece. "You cannot be serious," Lady Vane said the moment the door closed. Her voice had lost its court politeness entirely. "A kitchen girl, on the day of your coronation. Do you have any idea what this looks like?" "I did not choose this," Kellen said, and there was real strain in his voice, the sound of a man trying to hold two truths in his hands at once. "The bond chose. You know how this works. I cannot simply decide my mate is inconvenient and wish her away." "You can reject her," Lady Vane said flatly. "It has been done before. Kings have done it before, when the situation demanded it, and the situation demands it now. We are 3 weeks from finalizing the alliance with House Draven. 3 weeks, Kellen. If word gets out that you have found and accepted a fated mate who is a servant with no title, no lands, no family name worth mentioning, the Northern Pax will see it as an insult. They will see it as proof that Ashford blood does not respect tradition, does not respect strength, does not respect anything but sentiment." "She is not sentiment," Kellen said, though even as the words left his mouth, he felt how weak they sounded against the pressure building around him. "She is my mate." "She is a servant," Lady Vane said, and each word landed like a blow. "And you are a king who has been on the throne for exactly 6 hours. Do you know what your father would say if he were alive to see this?" Kellen flinched. That was a low strike, and Lady Vane knew it, and she used it anyway, because she had learned long ago that the fastest way to move a young king was to invoke the ghost of the old one. Kellen's father had ruled for 30 years, with an iron discipline that left no room for weakness, and Kellen had spent his entire life terrified of disappointing him, even now, even after death. "The pack elders are already talking," Lady Vane pressed on, sensing the crack she had opened. "They are asking whether a king who cannot control his own instincts on his coronation day can be trusted to control a kingdom. Every choice you make today will define how they see you for years. Do you want to be remembered as the king who let a servant girl dictate his reign before the sun had even set on his first day?" Kellen closed his eyes. Somewhere on the other side of that door, he could still feel her, faint and warm, like a candle flame he was being asked to pinch out with his bare fingers. His wolf howled in protest, a sound only he could hear, tearing through him with a grief that felt disproportionate to a woman he had known for less than an hour. But the human part of him, the part that had been trained since birth to put the pack above himself, was already listening to Lady Vane's logic, already building the justifications he would need to survive what he was about to do. "If I reject her," he said slowly, "what happens to her?" Lady Vane's expression did not soften. "She goes back to the kitchens. She lives her life. The rejection will hurt her for a time, the way these things always do, but she will heal. Servants are resilient. It is, forgive me, rather in the nature of their position." It was a cruel thing to say, and some part of Kellen recognized the cruelty even as he let it wash over him, because it was easier to believe a cruel thing than to face the truth of what he was about to do. He nodded once, sharply, the way his father used to nod when a decision had been made and there would be no further discussion. "Bring her back in," he said. "Let it be done quickly." When the doors opened again, and Kellen walked back into the throne hall, Ren felt her stomach drop before he had even reached her. Something in his face had changed. The warmth that had been there when he touched her hand was gone, replaced by a hard, distant coldness that made him look, suddenly, exactly like the kind of king who belonged on that throne and nowhere near her. "Ren Sorensen," he said, and his voice was flat and formal, pitched to carry across the entire hall so that every noble present could hear it clearly. "I have felt the bond between us. I acknowledge it exists, but I reject you as my mate." The words hit her like a physical blow, and she staggered slightly, one hand flying out to catch herself against nothing, because there was nothing there to catch. A rejection was not merely a social embarrassment for a wolf. It was a wound carved directly into the bond itself, a tearing sensation that started in the chest and spread outward, as if something essential had been ripped from her body without anesthetic. She gasped audibly, and several nobles nearby actually took a step back, as though her pain might be contagious. Kellen watched her sway on her feet, watched the color drain from her face, and something in his chest twisted so violently that he almost reached for her, almost took the words back before they had finished settling into the air. But Lady Vane's hand closed around his forearm, a silent and unmistakable warning, and he forced himself to stand still, to keep his expression carefully blank, because a king could not be seen to waver in front of his court. Ren did not cry. She would think about that later, in the days that followed, and wonder how she had managed not to cry in that moment, when every part of her felt like it was being torn in half. Perhaps it was shock. Perhaps it was pride, some stubborn kernel of dignity that refused to let her fall apart in front of people who already looked at her like she was less than human. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and looked directly into Kellen's eyes. "Understood, Your Majesty," she said, and her voice barely shook at all. Then she turned and walked out of the throne hall, her footsteps echoing against the marble floor, and she did not look back once, though every instinct in her body was screaming at her to run back to him, to beg him to take the words back, to do anything except leave that room with the bond in her chest, bleeding out with every step she took. Kellen stood frozen at the base of his throne, watching her go, and he told himself this was the right decision. He told himself the pain would pass, that this was simply the cost of ruling, that a king who could not sacrifice his own wants for the good of his kingdom was no king at all. He told himself all of this, and none of it made the hollow ache in his chest any smaller. Behind him, the court began to murmur again, this time with something like approval. "A strong king," he heard someone say, "a king who understands duty." Lady Vane's shoulders relaxed visibly, satisfied that disaster had been averted on the very first day of the new reign. But as Ren disappeared through the far doors and out of his sight, Kellen felt something inside him settle into place that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with loss, a cold, permanent weight that he suspected, even then, he had not seen the last of. That night, alone in his new chambers, he did not sleep. He lay in the enormous bed that had once belonged to his father and stared at the ceiling, and every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face in the moment before she turned away, the flicker of hope dying behind her eyes as his words landed. He told himself repeatedly that this feeling would fade by morning. He told himself that a king's first duty was to his kingdom, and that everything else, even a fated bond, had to bend to that duty. He did not yet understand that some things, once broken, do not simply fade. He did not yet understand that the bond he had just severed with a few careless words would not release him so easily, that somewhere beneath the surface of his newly won crown, a debt had just been created that he would spend a very long time trying to repay. Far below in the servants' quarters, in a small room she shared with two other kitchen girls, Ren Sorensen lay curled on her narrow bed with her back to the door, and she pressed one hand flat against her chest, as if she could physically hold herself together. The ache there had not lessened. If anything, it had grown sharper as the hours passed, a constant reminder of exactly what she had lost before she had even had the chance to understand what she was losing. She did not cry that night either. She simply lay there, wide awake, listening to the castle settle into silence around her, and somewhere in that silence, she made herself a quiet promise. She would not fall apart. She would not let this break her, not completely, no matter how much it hurt. Whatever happened next, whatever the king decided to do with the rest of his reign and his life, she would find a way to keep standing. She had no idea, as she finally drifted into an exhausted and uneasy sleep, that the king who had just shattered her heart in front of his entire court would spend the following weeks unable to stay away from her, unable to understand why rejecting the bond had not freed him the way everyone had promised it would, and unable to stop himself from seeking her out again and again with the same helpless, unanswerable question on his lips. 3 days after the rejection, Kellen Ashford found himself standing outside the kitchen door for the 4th time that week, telling himself, as he had told himself the previous 3 times, that he had simply come to check on the state of the royal stores before the harvest festival. It was a thin excuse. He knew it was thin, even as he thought it, but he clung to it anyway, because the alternative explanation was one he was not yet ready to face. The truth, which he would not admit to himself for several more days, was that he could feel her, not in the way he had felt her that first moment in the throne hall, not with the same overwhelming intensity, but as a faint and persistent thread that ran through his awareness, no matter what he was doing. He knew, without being told, roughly where she was in the castle at any given hour. He knew when her mood shifted, when something upset her, when she was tired. Rejection was supposed to sever this. Every book on bonded mates that he had frantically read in the past 3 nights insisted that a formal rejection cut the thread cleanly, that both wolves would be free of the pull within days. Kellen was not free of anything. He pushed open the kitchen door before he could stop himself, and the warm, bread-scented air rolled out to meet him. Several kitchen staff startled at the sight of their king standing in the doorway, and one young boy nearly dropped an entire tray of pastries in his shock. Kellen waved a hand in what he hoped was a reassuring gesture, though it likely looked as awkward as it felt. "Carry on," he said. "I am only looking for someone." His eyes found her almost immediately, as they always seemed to do now, no matter how large the room or how crowded. Wren stood at the far counter with her sleeves rolled up, kneading a mound of pale dough with steady, practiced hands. She had not looked up yet. He watched her work for a moment, noting the way she moved with quiet efficiency, the way she did not waste a single motion, and something in his chest tightened uncomfortably. Then she glanced up, and their eyes met, and he watched her entire posture change in an instant. Her shoulders squared, her jaw set. The soft focus of her concentration hardened into something guarded and wary, the look of someone bracing for another blow. He crossed the kitchen floor, aware of every eye in the room following him, and stopped a respectful distance from her counter. "Wren," he said. "Your Majesty," she replied, without pausing her kneading. He stood there for a moment, unsure exactly how to say the thing he had come to say, because even he was not entirely sure what that thing was. Finally, he settled on the question that had been circling his mind for 3 days straight, the one he could not seem to silence, no matter how foolish it sounded even to his own ears. "Are you still mad?" Wren's hands stilled on the dough for the briefest moment before resuming their motion. She did not look up at him again. "I am working, Your Majesty," she said. "If there is a matter of state that requires my attention, I would be glad to hear it. Otherwise, I have bread to prepare for tomorrow's council breakfast." It was not an answer, but it was also, somehow, an answer, and Kellen felt the sting of it land squarely in his chest. He stood there a moment longer, searching for something else to say, some way to bridge the sudden and enormous distance between them, but nothing came. Eventually he nodded stiffly, muttered something about the harvest stores that made no sense even to him, and left the kitchen with far less dignity than he had entered it. Behind him, one of the older kitchen staff, a broad-shouldered woman named Della, who had worked in the castle for over 20 years, watched him go with narrowed eyes. She glanced at Wren, who had not stopped kneading, though her hands were now moving with far more force than the dough required. "That is the 3rd time this week," Della said quietly. "I am aware," Wren said. "He rejected you in front of the whole court, and now he is following you around, asking if you are still mad, like a boy who broke a vase and wants to be forgiven before his mother finds out." Della shook her head. "Kings, I will never understand them." Wren said nothing, because there was nothing safe to say. She had spent the last 3 days trying to convince herself that the ache in her chest was fading, that time would do what time was supposed to do, and instead she found herself more raw with every encounter. Every time he appeared in a doorway with that same helpless, searching expression, every time he asked that same ridiculous question, as though her answer might somehow undo what he had already done in front of the entire court. She did not tell him the truth, which was that she was not simply mad. Mad was too small a word for what she felt. The rejection had left a wound that ached constantly, a phantom hollowness in her chest that made even simple tasks feel heavier than they should. She had cried, eventually, on the second night, after she had run out of the strength required to hold it in. She had cried until her pillow was damp and her throat was raw, and then she had gotten up the next morning and gone back to work, because the Kitchens did not care about broken hearts, and neither, she reminded herself, did kings. Word of Kellen's visits to the kitchen had already begun to spread through the castle staff, as such things always did. By the end of that week, nearly every servant below the fourth floor had heard some version of the story, embellished slightly more with each retelling, until it had become something of a quiet joke among the kitchen and laundry workers. The king who rejected his mate, and then could not stay away from her. Some found it amusing. Others, like Della, found it infuriating on Wren's behalf. Nobody found it particularly kingly. Lady Vane heard about it too, of course. Very little happened in that castle that escaped her notice for long, and she made a point of finding Kellen in his study on the fifth day, her expression carrying the particular tightness it always did when she was preparing to deliver criticism she considered constructive. "You have been visiting the Kitchens," she said, without preamble. Kellen did not look up from the papers on his desk, though his jaw tightened slightly. "I have been reviewing the harvest stores. 4 times in 1 week." Lady Vane folded her arms. The stores could be reviewed once, thoroughly, by a steward, and you would never need to set foot in that kitchen again. Instead, you go yourself, repeatedly, and each time you leave looking like a man who has lost an argument he never actually had. "I do not know what you are implying," Kellen said, though the flush creeping up his neck suggested otherwise. "I am implying nothing. I am stating plainly what every servant in this castle is already whispering about." Lady Vane's voice softened slightly, though not by much. "Kellen, you made the right decision. I know it did not feel right, and I know it does not feel right now, but it was the correct decision for your kingdom. If you continue to hover around that girl, asking her forgiveness like a boy caught stealing sweets, you will undo everything the rejection was meant to accomplish. You will make yourself look weak, and you will make her position here impossible. Is that truly what you want for her?" That last question landed harder than anything else Lady Vane had said, because it forced Kellen to confront something he had been avoiding since the coronation. He had told himself his visits to the kitchen were about checking on Wren, making sure she was managing, perhaps even easing some small portion of the guilt that sat like a stone in his stomach every time he thought of her face in the moment of rejection. But Lady Vane was right about one thing. His presence was not helping. Every visit only seemed to make things worse, drawing more attention to Wren, more whispers, more of the pitying and speculative looks that servants were now giving her whenever she crossed a room. "I will stop," he said finally, though the words felt like a lie even as he spoke them. Lady Vane studied him for a long moment, clearly unconvinced, but she nodded and left the study without further comment, satisfied that she had, at least for now, redirected her king back toward the path she had so carefully built for him. Kellen did try to stop. For 2 full days he did not go anywhere near the Kitchens, did not seek Wren out in any of the places he had come to associate with her presence. He threw himself into council meetings and border reports and the tedious business of learning to rule a kingdom, and he told himself repeatedly that the ache in his chest was simply the ordinary stress of a new reign, nothing more. But on the 3rd day, during a particularly long and dull meeting about grain taxation, he felt something shift through the bond, faint but unmistakable, a spike of distress that cut through his concentration like a blade. He sat frozen for a moment, gripping the edge of the council table, and then he was on his feet and moving before he had consciously decided to move at all, ignoring the startled protests of the council members he left behind. He found her in a narrow stairwell near the servants' quarters, sitting on the bottom step with her face pale and her hands trembling slightly in her lap. A younger servant girl, no older than 15, hovered nearby looking frightened. "She just went white all of a sudden, Your Majesty," the girl said quickly, clearly startled that the king himself had appeared. "I did not know what to do." Kellen crouched in front of Wren, ignoring every instinct that told him this was exactly the kind of behavior Lady Vane had warned him against. "Ren, look at me. What happened?" Ren blinked slowly, as though surfacing from somewhere far away, and focused on his face with visible effort. "I am fine," she said, though her voice was thin. "It happens sometimes. Since the rejection, the bond aches, and sometimes it aches badly enough that I lose my balance for a moment. It will pass." "You should be resting," Kellen said, and he heard the raw concern in his own voice before he could disguise it. "I have work to do," Ren said, already trying to push herself upright, though her legs did not fully cooperate on the first attempt. Kellen caught her elbow to steady her, and the contact sent a familiar warmth crackling between them, the same electric jolt he had felt in the throne hall days earlier. He saw Ren's breath catch, saw her eyes widen slightly before she deliberately schooled her expression back into neutral distance, pulling her arm free of his grip the moment she was steady on her feet. "Are you still mad?" he asked, and the moment the words left his mouth he wanted to pull them back, because he could hear exactly how foolish they sounded, how small and useless against the reality of what he had just witnessed. Ren turned to look at him fully then, and for the first time since the rejection, something like genuine anger flashed across her face, instead of the careful, controlled distance she had been maintaining. "You keep asking me that," she said, as though the answer will change something. "As though once I say yes or no, you can file it away and feel better about what you did. I am not simply mad, Your Majesty. I am in pain. Real pain, the kind that makes me lose my footing on staircases and lie awake at night, unable to breathe properly. That is not something you fix by asking if I am still mad. It is not something you fix at all, unless you can undo what you already did, and we both know you will not do that." She did not wait for a response. She turned and walked up the stairs, leaving Kellen standing at the bottom step with the younger servant girl, watching him with wide, uncertain eyes, and for the first time, the full weight of what he had done settled over him, not as an abstract political calculation, but as a real and ongoing injury he had inflicted on a living person who had done absolutely nothing to deserve it. He stood there for a long time after Ren disappeared from view, and when he finally returned to the council chamber, his advisors noted, with some concern, that their king seemed unusually distracted for the remainder of the day. The garden behind the east wing had always been Ren's favorite place in the castle, the one spot where she could steal a few quiet minutes away from the noise and heat of the kitchens. It was early morning, the kind of soft gray hour when the sun had not yet fully committed to rising, and she sat on the low stone bench near the fountain, with a cup of tea warming her hands, grateful for the silence. She did not expect to see him there. She had assumed, after their conversation on the stairwell 3 days earlier, that Kellen would finally take her words to heart and keep his distance. She had almost convinced herself that things were beginning to settle into a manageable rhythm, that the ache in her chest, while still present, was at least becoming something she could carry without stumbling. Then she heard footsteps on the gravel path, and she looked up to see the king approaching, dressed simply for once, without the heavy formal robes he usually wore, and something in her stomach twisted, despite her best efforts to remain unaffected. "I am not here to ask if you are still mad," Kellen said before she could speak, holding up both hands as though surrendering. "I promised myself I would not ask that again." Ren said nothing, watching him warily as he stopped a careful distance away, close enough to speak without shouting, but far enough to respect the boundary he had clearly decided to observe this time. "May I sit?" he asked, gesturing to the far end of the bench. She considered refusing. Every instinct told her that keeping distance was safer, that every moment spent near him only deepened whatever strange and painful connection still bound them together, despite his rejection. But there was something in his face that morning, a tiredness that had not been there before, dark circles beneath his eyes that suggested he had not been sleeping any better than she had. "It is a public garden," she said finally. "I cannot stop you from sitting wherever you wish." He took that as permission and lowered himself onto the far end of the bench, careful to leave a wide gap between them. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The fountain trickled quietly nearby, and somewhere in the distance, a bird began its morning song, oblivious to the tension sitting heavy in the cool air. "I have been reading," Kellen said finally, "about bonded mates. about rejection. I did not do enough research before the coronation. I assumed, because everyone told me, that rejection was simple, that it hurt for a short time, and then released both parties cleanly. I did not know it could linger like this. I did not know it could hurt you physically, the way it did on the stairs. Would it have changed your decision? Ren asked, and there was no accusation in her voice, only genuine curiosity, though the question still landed with weight between them. Kellen considered this honestly, turning it over in his mind rather than giving her the easy, reassuring answer that would have cost him nothing. I do not know, he admitted. I would like to believe it would have. But I was under enormous pressure that day, pressure I had never faced before, and I made the choice my advisors told me was necessary for the kingdom. I am not certain I would have found the strength to refuse them, even if I had understood the full cost. Ren appreciated the honesty, even if it did nothing to ease the ache still living in her chest. She had grown weary of empty reassurances, of people telling her what she wanted to hear, simply to smooth over an uncomfortable moment. At least Kellen, whatever else he was not currently lying to her. "Why did you come here this morning?" she asked. "Because I could not stay away," he said simply. "I told myself I would give you space. I meant it when I said it. But I woke before dawn, and I could feel, somehow, that you were sitting alone somewhere quiet, and I found myself walking here before I had fully decided to come. I do not fully understand why the bond still pulls at me this strongly. Every account I have read says it should have faded by now." "Perhaps," Ren said slowly, testing the idea even as she spoke it aloud for the first time. "It has not faded because a true rejection requires more than words spoken in a throne hall. Perhaps it requires something deeper, some genuine severing of intent, and you have not truly severed anything. You have only said the words while some other part of you refuses to let go." Kellen turned to look at her fully then, something shifting behind his eyes as her words settled into him. He had not considered that possibility before, had assumed the mechanics of rejection were purely ceremonial, a formal declaration that automatically produced its intended effect regardless of what lay beneath it. But Ren's theory made a strange kind of sense, and it frightened him slightly, because if she was right, it meant the ache he carried was not some temporary aftershock destined to fade with time. It meant it was a direct reflection of his own unresolved feelings, feelings he had been trying very hard not to examine too closely. "I should not have rejected you," he said quietly, the admission slipping out before he could stop it, more honest than anything he had said to her since the coronation. "I knew it the moment the words left my mouth. I saw your face, and I knew I had made a mistake, but by then, it was already done, and I did not know how to undo it without looking weak in front of my entire court." "You could have simply not done it in the first place," Ren said, and there was an edge to her voice now, sharp enough to remind them both that an apology, however sincere, did not erase what had already happened. "You could have stood up to Lady Vane. You could have told your council that you would not be bullied into rejecting a bond you had only just discovered, that you needed time to think before making an irreversible decision. Instead, you let them push you into hurting me in front of hundreds of people, and now you sit here telling me you regret it, as though regret is somehow enough." Kellen absorbed this without flinching, though it clearly cost him something to do so. "You are right," he said. "I am not asking you to forgive me. I know that would be far too much to ask, and honestly, I am not certain I deserve it. I only wanted you to know that I understand, now, what I did. I am not proud of it." I have not been proud of very much since that morning. They sat in silence again after that, though it felt different than the silence before, less guarded, though still heavy with everything unresolved between them. Ren studied the fountain, rather than looking at him, trying to sort through the tangle of feelings his words had stirred up. Part of her wanted to remain angry, to hold on to the fury that had felt, in recent days, like the only thing keeping her upright. But another part of her, quieter and more vulnerable, recognized something genuine in his admission, and that recognition frightened her more than his earlier careless questions ever had. "What do you want from me, Kellen?" she asked finally, using his given name for the first time since the coronation, and she watched something flicker across his face at the sound of it, something that looked almost like relief. "I do not know exactly," he admitted. "I know I want the ache to stop, for both of us. I know I want to find some way to make this right, though I am not certain such a thing is even possible after what I have done. Mostly, I think, I simply want you to know that what happened in that throne hall was not because you were unworthy. It was never about you. It was about my own fear and my own weakness, and I let both of those things cost you something I had no right to take. Ren felt tears prick unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, and she blinked them back fiercely, unwilling to let herself cry in front of him again, not after she had worked so hard to keep her composure through every previous encounter. "That is a nice thing to say," she said, her voice tight. "It does not undo the pain in my chest. It does not undo the whispers I hear every time I walk through this castle, or the way people look at me now, like I am something pitiable. Words are easy, Kellen. Actions are harder." "Then tell me what action you need," he said, leaning forward slightly, earnest in a way she had not seen from him before. "Tell me what would actually help, and I will do it, whatever it costs me." Ren opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again, because the honest truth was that she did not know. She had spent the last week simply trying to survive the pain, trying to hold herself together through each shift and each whispered comment, and she had not allowed herself the luxury of imagining what repair might actually look like. The question caught her off guard, and for a moment, she simply sat there, turning it over, uncertain. "I need time," she said finally. "I need you to stop appearing in every corner of this castle, asking me the same question over and over, because it does not help. It only reopens the wound each time. If you truly want to make something right, give me space to heal on my own terms, without the added pressure of managing your guilt on top of my own pain." Kellen absorbed this, and though it clearly was not the answer he had hoped for, something that might have been easier to fix immediately, he nodded slowly. "I can do that," he said. "I will do that." He rose from the bench, careful and deliberate, and for a moment, he simply looked at her, memorizing the way the early light caught the loose strands of her hair, the tired set of her shoulders, the quiet strength she carried even now, even after everything he had done to her. Then he turned and walked back toward the castle, leaving her alone in the garden with the fountain trickling softly beside her. Ren watched him go, and once he was safely out of sight, she allowed herself to press both hands against her face, and finally let a few of the tears escape that she had been holding back throughout their entire conversation. It was not relief exactly, and it was not renewed anger either. It was something more complicated, a slow and unwelcome recognition that despite everything, despite the humiliation and the pain, and the very real damage he had caused, some small and stubborn part of her chest still ached toward him, still responded to his presence with the same helpless pull that had first drawn her to that throne hall a week earlier. She hated that part of herself in that moment, hated how difficult it was to hold on to pure anger when he kept showing her glimpses of genuine remorse, kept offering pieces of honesty that made him harder to dismiss as simply cruel or thoughtless. It would have been so much easier, she thought, if he were only a villain, if his every word and action confirmed that she was right to want nothing further to do with him. Instead, he kept complicating things, kept making her wonder, against her own better judgment, whether there might be more to this story than a single terrible decision made under pressure. She finished her tea slowly, watching the sun finally break fully over the garden wall, and then she stood, smoothed her apron, and walked back toward the kitchens to begin another long day of work, carrying with her both the ache that had not left and the new, uncertain question of what, exactly, Kellen Ashford intended to do with the promise he had just made her. That question would not stay unanswered for long, though the path toward its resolution would prove far more complicated than either of them expected. Filled with political maneuvering, unexpected rivals, and a growing awareness on both their parts that some bonds, however badly damaged, do not simply disappear because both people wish very hard for them to do so. Kellen kept his word for exactly 9 days, and during those 9 days, he threw himself into the business of ruling, with a discipline that surprised even Lady Vane, who had begun to worry that her king had lost his focus entirely. He sat through every council meeting without wandering attention. He reviewed border reports late into the night. He met with visiting dignitaries and negotiated grain prices and settled a minor dispute between 2 noble houses over water rights. And through all of it, he did not once seek out Ren Sorensen, though the effort of restraint cost him more than anyone around him understood. The bond had not faded during those 9 days. If anything, staying away from her seemed to sharpen his awareness of it, the way a person notices a small ache, far more acutely, once they stop moving and sit still with it. He felt her presence in the castle like a low, constant hum beneath everything else he did, and more than once, he caught himself pausing mid-sentence during a meeting, distracted by some faint shift in her mood that he had no way of explaining to the confused advisors watching him. It was during a formal dinner on the 9th evening, held to welcome a delegation from a neighboring pack, that everything he had been carefully holding together very nearly came undone. The delegation had arrived that afternoon, led by Alpha Callum Drake of the Thornwood pack, a broad-shouldered man a few years older than Kellen, with an easy, confident charm that had already won over several members of the court within hours of his arrival. The visit was meant to smooth relations along a contested stretch of border territory, and Lady Vane had spent weeks preparing for it, determined that nothing would go wrong during this delicate diplomatic exchange. Kellen sat at the head of the long dining table, only half listening to Callum's stories of border skirmishes and hunting expeditions, his attention drifting more than he wanted it to. It was not until the servants began bringing out the second course that he understood why his focus kept slipping. Wren was among them. He had not known she would be assigned to serve at this particular dinner. Kitchen staff rotated through various duties, depending on the size and importance of an event, and apparently tonight's delegation required extra hands. He watched her move along the far side of the table with a tray balanced expertly on one arm, setting dishes before each guest with practiced efficiency, and he felt the bond in his chest tighten with an intensity he had not experienced since the coronation itself. Callum noticed her too. Of course he did. Wren was, whatever else the court chose to believe about her low station, genuinely striking, with dark eyes and a quiet grace to her movements that drew attention, even when she clearly did not want it. Kellen watched, with a growing and unwelcome tension building behind his ribs, as Callum's gaze followed Wren down the length of the table, lingering longer than simple courtesy required. When she reached Callum's place setting to fill his cup with wine, the visiting Alpha turned to her with an easy smile. "And what is your name?" he asked, his tone warm and genuinely curious, none of the dismissive coldness that most nobles reserved for servants. Wren hesitated, clearly startled by the direct attention, but answered politely. "Wren, my lord." "Wren," Callum repeated, as though testing the sound of it. "A lovely name. Tell me, Wren, has anyone ever told you that you have remarkable composure? Most servants I encounter seem terrified simply to be in the same room as visiting nobility, yet you move as though you belong here." Wren, caught off guard by the compliment, allowed a small, genuine smile to cross her face, the first real smile Kellen had seen from her in weeks. "I have worked in this castle a long time, my lord. I suppose I have simply grown used to the company, whatever their station." Callum laughed, a warm, easy sound that carried down the table, and several nearby nobles chuckled along with him, charmed by the exchange. Kellen sat rigid in his seat, his knuckles white where his hand gripped the stem of his wineglass, and he felt something dark and unfamiliar coiling in his chest, a possessive fury that startled him with its sudden ferocity. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself he had no right to feel anything at all, given that he was the one who had rejected her in front of the entire court, given that he had no claim over her attention, or her smiles, or the way she chose to spend her evenings. But his wolf did not care about the fine details of who deserved what. His wolf only understood that another alpha was showing clear interest in his mate, and every instinct in his body screamed at him to intervene, to put himself between them, to remind Callum in no uncertain terms exactly whose bond this was. He forced himself to stay seated. He forced himself to keep his expression neutral, to nod along with whatever conversation was happening around him, though he could not have repeated a single word of it afterward. Wren continued her rounds, serving the remaining guests, and Callum's attention followed her for the rest of the meal, his questions growing progressively more personal, his laughter at her responses growing progressively warmer. By the time the dinner concluded, Kellen had barely eaten anything, and the tension in his shoulders had become so pronounced that Lady Vane, seated beside him, finally leaned over to murmur a quiet inquiry about his health. "I am fine," he said tersely, though the words came out sharper than he intended. As the guests began rising from the table, drifting into smaller groups for after-dinner conversation, Kellen watched with mounting alarm as Callum crossed the room directly toward where Wren stood near the serving table, gathering empty dishes onto a tray. "Might I have a moment of your time?" Callum asked her, his voice low enough that most of the room did not hear, though Kellen, straining every sense toward her, caught every word. "I am working, my lord," Wren said, though there was no sharpness in her tone, only the practical honesty of someone genuinely occupied. "Of course," Callum said easily. "Then perhaps tomorrow. I understand there is a garden here that is particularly pleasant in the morning. I would enjoy the company, if you would permit it." Kellen did not remember crossing the room. One moment he was standing near the head table, and the next he was beside them, close enough that both Wren and Callum turned in surprise at his sudden appearance. "Alpha Drake," Kellen said, his voice carefully controlled despite the fury simmering just beneath the surface. "I trust you found the meal satisfactory." Callum, unbothered, gave a slow, knowing smile that suggested he understood exactly what had just prompted the king's abrupt arrival. "Excellent, Your Majesty. Your kitchen staff are remarkably skilled." His gaze flicked briefly toward Wren before returning to Kellen. "In every capacity, it seems." The implication hung heavy in the air, and Kellen felt his jaw clench so tightly it ached. He was acutely aware of Wren standing between them, her expression carefully blank, though he could feel, faintly, through the bond, a current of discomfort radiating from her, at being caught in the middle of whatever tension had just materialized. "If you will excuse us," Kellen said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I have matters to discuss with my kitchen staff, regarding tomorrow's arrangements." It was a transparent excuse, and everyone standing there understood it as such, but Callum, with the easy grace of a man who enjoyed provoking reactions more than pursuing genuine conflict, simply inclined his head and stepped back. "Of course, Your Majesty. I look forward to continuing our discussions tomorrow." His gaze lingered on Wren for one final moment before he turned and rejoined the other guests. Kellen waited until Callum was safely out of earshot before turning to Wren, and he immediately regretted the sharpness he heard creeping into his own voice. "You should not encourage him," he said. Wren's eyes flashed with immediate anger, all the careful neutrality she had maintained throughout the dinner evaporating at once. "Encourage him? I did nothing but answer a polite question, Your Majesty. Unlike some, he at least had the decency to speak to me as though I were a person rather than furniture." The words struck exactly where she intended them to, and Kellen felt the sting of them land squarely in his chest. "That is not fair," he said, though even as he spoke he understood how weak the protest sounded. "Is it not?" Wren asked, setting down her tray with more force than necessary. "You reject me in front of the entire court. You spend a week following me around, asking if I am still angry. And now, the moment another alpha shows me a small kindness, you appear from nowhere, looking as though you might tear the room apart. You do not get to have both, Kellen. You do not get to discard the bond and still guard it jealously whenever it suits you." Kellen had no answer for that, because she was, infuriatingly, entirely correct. He stood there in silence, watching her gather her tray again, and walk away toward the kitchens, and the ache in his chest, which had never fully faded during the past 9 days, now roared back to full, unbearable intensity, made worse by the sharp new addition of jealousy, tangled through the guilt he already carried. He remained in the dining hall long after the other guests had dispersed, staring at the empty space where she had stood, and he understood, with a growing and uncomfortable clarity, that his careful 9 days of restraint had accomplished nothing except to leave the field open for another man to step in and claim what he himself had thrown away out of fear. The realization settled over him like a physical weight, and for the first time since the coronation, he began to seriously consider what it might mean to fight for something he had once been too afraid to keep. Sleep did not come easily to Kellen that night, and by the time the first gray light of morning crept through his chamber windows, he had already made a decision that would have horrified Lady Vane had she known about it. He was going to the garden. He knew Callum intended to seek Wren out there, had said as much openly the previous evening, and Kellen had spent the entire night convincing himself that arriving first was not jealousy, but simple prudence. a king protecting his household from an outside alpha's inappropriate advances toward castle staff. He knew, even as he told himself this, that it was not entirely true, but it was easier to believe than the alternative, which was that he simply could not bear the thought of another man sitting beside Ren on that stone bench, hearing her voice, watching the way the morning light caught in her dark hair. He arrived at the garden before the sun had fully cleared the eastern wall, and he found Ren already there, sitting exactly where she had sat the last time they spoke, a cup of tea cooling untouched in her hands. She looked up when she heard his footsteps on the gravel path, and her expression shifted immediately into wary caution. "I thought we agreed you would give me space," she said, though there was less heat in her voice than he expected, more exhaustion than anger. "I know," Kellen said. "I am sorry. I will leave the moment you ask me to. I only wanted to speak with you before Callum arrived." Ren's eyebrows rose slightly. "You came to warn me away from him." "I came to make sure you understood what kind of man he is," Kellen said, and even as the words left his mouth, he heard how poorly they landed, how much like exactly the possessive, controlling behavior she had accused him of the previous night. He tried again, more carefully. "That is not entirely honest. I came because I could not stop thinking about the way he looked at you last night, and I did not sleep, and I told myself a dozen different reasons why that should not matter to me, and none of them convinced me even slightly." Ren set down her teacup, studying him with an expression he could not quite read. "You have no right to be jealous, Kellen. You gave up that right when you stood in front of your entire court and told everyone I meant nothing to you." "I never said you meant nothing," Kellen said, his voice rougher than he intended. "I said I rejected the bond. Those are not the same thing, though I understand why the distinction feels meaningless to you right now. I have spent every day since that morning trying to understand why I still feel this pull toward you, why nothing about rejecting you has actually released either of us the way it was supposed to. And last night, watching Callum speak to you so easily, I finally understood something I have been avoiding for weeks." "And what is that?" Ren asked, though her voice had softened slightly, curious despite herself. "That I do not actually want to be free of the bond," Kellen said. "I told myself that was the goal, that severing it would solve everything, restore order, protect the alliance with the northern packs. But watching another man show interest in you last night, I realized I have been lying to myself this entire time. I do not want to be free of you, Ren. I want to fix what I broke, if that is even possible, though I understand you may never trust me enough to let me try." The silence that followed stretched long and taut between them, filled with the soft trickle of the fountain and the distant call of birds waking in the garden trees. Ren studied his face carefully, searching for some sign of insincerity, some indication that this was simply another performance meant to smooth over his guilt. But she found only raw honesty there, the same exhausted vulnerability she had glimpsed in their previous conversation, deepened now by what appeared to be genuine fear. "Do you understand what you are asking?" she said finally. "You want me to open myself back up to a man who has already proven, in front of the entire court, that political pressure will always outweigh his feelings for me when it truly matters. What happens the next time your council decides my presence is inconvenient? What happens when the alliance with House Draven demands another sacrifice? Will you stand firm then? Or will you fold again, the way you folded on the very first day?" Kellen absorbed this without flinching, though every word landed like a blow, each one precisely aimed and entirely deserved. "I do not know," he admitted. "I would like to believe I would stand firm. I have thought about very little else these past 9 days, except how badly I failed you that morning, and how much I regret not finding the courage to refuse Lady Vane when she pressed me. But I understand that promises are cheap after the damage is already done. I cannot prove to you with words that I would choose differently next time. I can only try to show you, through actions, over time, that I am not the same frightened man who stood on that throne room floor and let his advisors make the hardest decision of his life for him." Before Ren could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps on the gravel path interrupted them, and both turned to see Callum Drake striding toward the garden with the easy, confident gait of a man entirely comfortable in his own skin. He slowed slightly upon seeing Kellen already present, his expression shifting into something amused rather than surprised, as though he had half expected exactly this outcome. "Your Majesty," Callum said, inclining his head with exaggerated courtesy. I did not realize you also enjoyed morning walks in the garden. I find the fresh air clears my thoughts before council meetings, Kellen said, his tone carefully, even despite the tension coiling through his frame. Callum's gaze moved between Kellen and Wren, taking in the charged atmosphere between them with obvious interest, and a slow, knowing smile spread across his face. I see. Well, I would not wish to intrude on royal business. Wren, perhaps another morning. That is entirely up to her, Kellen said quickly, before he could stop himself, and he saw Wren's eyebrows lift in surprise at the deliberate restraint in his words, the visible effort it clearly cost him to say them. Callum studied Kellen for a long moment, something calculating behind his easy smile, and then he turned his attention fully to Wren. The choice is yours, of course. I only offered pleasant company for a morning walk. Nothing more sinister than that. Whatever suspicions our king here seems to be entertaining. Wren looked between the two men, feeling the weight of their attention settle over her like an uncomfortable cloak, and she found herself, for the first time in weeks, genuinely uncertain what she wanted. Part of her recognized the appeal of Callum's easy warmth, the simplicity of a connection, uncomplicated by rejection and political maneuvering, and the sharp ache of a bond gone wrong. But another part of her, the part she had been trying very hard to ignore since the coronation, still responded to Kellen with an intensity that frightened her, a pull that had never once faded, despite everything he had done to try to sever it. I appreciate the offer, my lord, she said carefully, choosing her words with deliberate caution. But I have duties in the kitchen this morning that require my attention. Perhaps another time. It was a diplomatic answer, neither acceptance nor outright rejection, and Callum accepted it with the same easy grace he brought to everything, inclining his head once more before turning to leave the garden, though not before casting one final, considering glance back at Kellen that carried an unmistakable challenge in it. Once he had gone, Wren rose from the bench, gathering her cooling teacup, and Kellen watched her with an expression caught somewhere between relief and continued uncertainty. Thank you, he said quietly, for not making this harder than it already is. I did not do that for you, Wren said, though there was less bite in her voice than her words suggested. I did it because I am not ready to trust either of you fully, and I would rather figure out what I actually want before I let anyone else decide it for me. She left the garden then, walking back toward the castle with careful, measured steps, and Kellen remained on the bench for a long time afterward, turning her words over in his mind, understanding that whatever ground he had gained that morning remained fragile and easily lost, that the true test of everything he had said would come not in quiet garden conversations, but in whatever difficult choices lay ahead, choices that would demand far more from him than pretty words and honest confessions. He did not yet know how soon that test would arrive, or how much more he would be forced to sacrifice before Wren could ever begin to believe that this time he truly meant to stand firm. Lady Vane summoned Kellen to her private study 2 days later, and the moment he stepped through the door, he understood from the set of her shoulders and the careful arrangement of papers on her desk that whatever conversation awaited him would not be pleasant. Sit, she said, without her usual formal address, which told him more about her state of mind than any words could have. He sat. Alpha Drake has requested a private audience before his delegation departs tomorrow, Lady Vane said, folding her hands together on the desk. He wishes to discuss the terms of the border agreement, but he has also made a rather unusual request, one that I confess has caught me entirely off guard. What request? Kellen asked, though something in his stomach had already begun to sink, some instinct warning him what was coming before Lady Vane spoke it aloud. He has asked for permission to formally court the servant girl, Wren Sorensen, as a potential mate for his own pack. Lady Vane watched Kellen's face carefully as she delivered this news, and whatever reaction she had expected, she clearly found it in the way his expression hardened instantly, the way his hands curled into fists on the arms of his chair. He claims to have felt an unusual connection to her during his visit, and given that you rejected the bond, he sees no obstacle to pursuing her himself. From a diplomatic standpoint, Kellen, this could actually work in our favor. A marriage alliance between one of our own household members and the Thornwood pack would strengthen the border agreement significantly, perhaps more permanently than the original alliance we had been negotiating with House Draven. Kellen sat rigid in his chair, processing this information with a rising sense of horror that he made no effort to disguise. You cannot be suggesting we simply hand her over to him. I am suggesting, Lady Vane said carefully, that this may present an unexpected solution to a problem that has been complicating your reign since the very first morning of your rule. If the girl marries Alpha Drake, the bond between you and her becomes entirely irrelevant. There will be no more whispers, no more concern about your attachment to a servant undermining your authority. The alliance with Thornwood will be secured through marriage rather than mere diplomacy, which is, historically, a far more durable foundation. Everyone benefits. Everyone except Ren, Kellen said, his voice low and dangerous in a way that made Lady Vane pause, clearly unaccustomed to hearing that particular tone from him. Has anyone actually asked her what she wants? Or are we simply going to decide her future for her again, the way we did on the day of my coronation, and call it diplomacy? Lady Vane's expression tightened. Kellen, I understand this is a difficult subject given everything that has happened between the two of you, but I must remind you, as I have reminded you before, that you are a king, and kings do not have the luxury of prioritizing personal feelings over the well-being of an entire pack. If this arrangement secures peace along our northern border for a generation, the discomfort of one servant girl, however unfortunate, cannot reasonably outweigh that benefit. She is not simply one servant girl, Kellen said, rising from his chair so abruptly that Lady Vane startled slightly. She is my mate, whatever words I said in that throne hall, whatever rejection I forced myself through under your counsel. I have spent the last 2 weeks trying to understand why the bond between us has not faded the way it was supposed to, and I finally understand why. It is because some part of me never actually wanted to let her go. I was a coward that morning, Lady Vane, and I have regretted it every single day since, and I will not compound that mistake by standing aside while you hand her off to another alpha as though she were a piece of territory to be negotiated away for political gain. Lady Vane stared at him, clearly taken aback by the force of his conviction, something she had not witnessed from him since before the coronation, when he had been a younger, less careful prince, rather than a king, weighed down by the burdens of his position. This is a mistake, she said finally, though her voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. You are letting emotion cloud your judgment at exactly the moment your judgment matters most. Perhaps, Kellen said. Or perhaps I let emotion get pushed aside once already, at exactly the moment it mattered most, and I am not willing to make that same mistake twice. He left her study without waiting for further argument, his mind already racing ahead to what he needed to do next. He found Ren in the laundry room this time, sorting through piles of linens with 2 other servants, and when she saw the expression on his face, she immediately excused herself from her companions and stepped into the hallway to speak with him privately, sensing that whatever had brought him here was serious enough to warrant the interruption. What has happened? She asked, studying his tense expression with obvious concern, despite everything unresolved between them. Callum has requested permission to court you, Kellen said, watching her face carefully for her reaction. Lady Vane believes it could strengthen the border alliance. She wants me to allow it. Ren went very still, processing this information with a complicated mixture of emotions crossing her features. And what did you tell her? I told her I would not allow it, Kellen said. But I realized, walking here, that this is not actually my decision to make. It is yours. I have spent the last 2 weeks trying to convince you that I regret rejecting the bond, that I want to fix what I broke, and yet here I am, once again making decisions about your future, without asking what you actually want. So I am asking now, do you have any interest in Callum's offer? Ren considered the question seriously, aware of the weight it carried, aware that her answer would shape the direction of everything that followed. Part of her, the part still raw and wounded from Kellen's rejection, found something appealing in the idea of a clean start, a chance to be wanted openly and completely by someone who had never caused her pain, someone whose interest came without the complicated tangle of guilt and history that colored everything between herself and Kellen. But another part of her, larger than she wanted to admit, recognized that whatever she felt toward Callum was pleasant curiosity at best, Nothing close to the overwhelming, undeniable pull that had gripped her the moment she walked into that throne hall weeks earlier. That pull had never fully released her, no matter how much pain it had caused, no matter how badly she wished sometimes that it would simply fade and leave her free. "No," she said finally, and she watched relief flood visibly across Kellen's face before she continued. "I have no interest in Callum's offer. But that does not mean I am ready to simply forgive you either, Kellen. Refusing him is not the same as choosing you. I need you to understand that distinction clearly, because I think you are the kind of man who might mistake one for the other if I let you." "I understand," Kellen said, though the relief in his voice was unmistakable. "I am not asking for forgiveness today. I am only grateful you will not be forced into a decision neither of us actually wants." Ren studied him for a long moment, noting the genuine conviction in his stance, the way he had clearly stood against Lady Vane's counsel this time, rather than simply bending to it, as he had on the morning of the coronation. It was a small thing, perhaps, in the grand scheme of everything that had happened between them, but it was also, she recognized, the first real evidence she had seen that he might actually be capable of the change he kept promising her. "Tell Callum yourself," she said finally. "Not through Lady Vane, not through some official channel. If you truly mean what you say about standing firm this time, tell him directly, and let him hear it from you." Kellen nodded without hesitation. "I will." He found Callum later that afternoon in the castle's outer courtyard, preparing his horse for the following morning's departure, and he delivered the message plainly and without diplomatic softening, informing the visiting Alpha that Ren had no interest in his courtship, and that the matter was closed. Callum, to his credit, accepted the news with reasonable grace, though not without one final, pointed observation. "You fought harder for her just now than you did on the morning you rejected her," he said, swinging up onto his horse with easy confidence. "I hope, for both your sakes, that this newfound courage of yours proves more permanent than the last." The words followed Kellen long after Callum's delegation had ridden out through the castle gates the next morning, a challenge he carried with him through the following weeks, a reminder that words and momentary conviction meant little if they were not eventually matched by sustained, consistent action over time, action that would need to withstand far greater pressures than a single visiting Alpha's polite interest in a kitchen servant. The weeks that followed brought a strange and uneasy peace to the castle, though Kellen understood, even as he settled into it, that peace of this kind rarely lasted long in a kingdom still finding its footing under a new ruler. He kept his distance from Ren in the way she had asked, no longer appearing unexpectedly in kitchens or stairwells, but he found other ways to make his intentions known, small gestures that required no words and demanded nothing of her in return. He arranged, quietly and without announcement, for her to be moved from the general kitchen staff into a position overseeing the castle's herb gardens and food stores, a role that carried more responsibility, better pay, and considerably more respect among the household staff. He made certain the promotion appeared to come through the ordinary channels of the head steward's recommendation, rather than his own direct intervention, unwilling to make her the subject of gossip once again by having the king's hand appear too obviously behind her advancement. He also began, gradually, to change the way he governed. Where he had once deferred almost automatically to Lady Vane's counsel, he now questioned her more carefully, weighed her advice against his own judgment rather than accepting it wholesale, and on several occasions overruled her outright when he believed her proposals prioritized political convenience over genuine fairness. It was not always the easier path. Lady Vane grew increasingly frustrated with what she saw as her king's stubbornness, and more than once their disagreements grew heated enough that other council members exchanged uncomfortable glances across the meeting table. But Kellen found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he did not mind the friction nearly as much as he once had. There was something clarifying about finally standing firm on his own convictions, rather than constantly bending to the expectations others placed on him. And though the process was uncomfortable, he began to feel, for the first time since his coronation, something like genuine confidence in his own judgment as a ruler. Ren noticed the changes, of course. It would have been impossible not to notice, given how quickly word traveled through the castle staff about anything involving the king. She heard about her own promotion before the official announcement reached her, whispered excitedly by Della, who had grown increasingly protective of Ren over the preceding weeks, and took no small satisfaction in seeing her finally recognized for her genuine skill and hard work. She heard too about the shifting dynamic in the council chamber, about the king who had once seemed so easily swayed, now standing firm against pressure from his most senior advisor. She heard these things secondhand, through the constant flow of servant gossip, and she found herself, against her own careful resolve, paying closer attention to each new report than she wanted to admit. One evening, nearly a month after Callum's departure, she found herself walking through the castle's central courtyard as the sun set behind the western towers, carrying a basket of fresh herbs back toward the kitchen stores, and she came upon Kellen standing alone near the old stone well, staring up at the darkening sky with an expression she could not quite read from a distance. She almost turned away, unwilling to disturb whatever private moment he seemed to be having, but something made her pause, some small curiosity that had been building steadily over the past weeks, despite her best efforts to suppress it. She approached slowly, and he turned at the sound of her footsteps, visible surprise crossing his face at finding her there unannounced, given how carefully they had both maintained their distance since their last real conversation. "I did not expect to find you out here," he said. "Neither did I expect to find you," Ren replied, setting her basket down on the low wall surrounding the well. "I heard about the disagreement in council today. Della said you overruled Lady Vane in front of the entire chamber." Kellen's expression flickered with something like embarrassment, though also a quiet pride he made no effort to hide. She proposed raising taxes on the northern farming villages to fund additional border garrisons, despite the fact that those same villages have already suffered 2 poor harvests in a row. I could not agree to it. It would have crushed people who are already struggling to survive. "That is not a decision Lady Vane would have made lightly," Ren observed. "No," Kellen agreed, "but it is not a decision I could make lightly either. Not anymore. I spent a long time being the kind of king who let his advisors make the difficult choices for him, and I have learned, rather painfully, what that costs the people affected by those choices. I do not intend to make that mistake again, whether the person harmed is a servant girl I claimed as my mate, or a village of farmers struggling through a hard winter." Ren studied him carefully in the fading light, noting the sincerity in his voice, the way his convictions seemed to come not from a desire to prove something to her specifically, but from a genuine shift in how he understood his own responsibilities. It was, she recognized, exactly the kind of change she had told him would be necessary if he ever hoped to earn back any measure of her trust, though she had not expected to see it demonstrated so clearly in a matter entirely unrelated to their own tangled history. "You have changed," she said quietly, almost to herself. "I have tried to," Kellen said. "I cannot undo what happened on the morning of my coronation. I understand that some wounds do not simply disappear because the person who caused them decides to become a better man afterward. But I have tried, every day since, to become someone who would not make that same mistake again. Someone who could stand in front of pressure from people like Lady Vane and choose fairness over convenience, courage over fear." They stood together in silence for a moment, the last light of the sunset fading into deep purple twilight around them, the courtyard growing quiet as the castle settled into evening routines elsewhere. Ren felt something loosening in her chest that she had not expected, some small portion of the careful guard she had maintained around herself for weeks beginning, cautiously, to ease. "I am not ready to simply forget what happened," she said finally. "I do not think I will ever be ready to forget it entirely, but I have been watching you these past weeks, Kellen, whether I intended to or not, and I have seen something that looks like genuine change, not performance meant to win me over, but real, consistent effort that continues even when I am not there to witness it." "That is because it is not for you," Kellen said gently. "Or rather, it is not only for you. I want to be a good king regardless of whether you ever forgive me, but I will not pretend that watching you these past weeks, from a distance, respecting the space you asked for, has not also been its own kind of motivation. Every difficult choice I make, I find myself wondering whether it is the kind of choice that would make you believe I have actually changed, rather than simply decided to say the right words for a while until the pressure eases." Ren allowed herself a small, tired smile, the first genuine warmth she had shown him in weeks. That is perhaps the most honest thing you have said to me since the coronation. I am trying to be honest with you as often as I can manage, Kellen said. It seems the least I owe you, given everything else. They did not resolve anything further that evening. Wren gathered her basket of herbs and continued toward the kitchen stores, and Kellen remained by the well a while longer, watching the stars emerge slowly overhead, feeling something that had been tightly wound in his chest for weeks, finally begin, very slightly, to ease. It was not forgiveness, not yet, and he understood that forgiveness, if it ever came at all, would need to be earned through many more months of consistent effort, rather than granted after a single pleasant conversation in a darkening courtyard. But it was, he thought, as he finally turned to walk back toward his own chambers, a beginning, the first real sign since that terrible morning, that the bridge between them, however badly damaged, was not beyond all hope of repair. The true test of everything Kellen had promised arrived without warning on a cold morning nearly 2 months after his coronation, when a messenger arrived from House Draven bearing news that sent the entire castle into a state of controlled panic. Lord Edric Voss, head of House Draven and the man Lady Vane had spent years courting for the original alliance marriage, had grown impatient with the delayed negotiations and was demanding an immediate answer regarding a formal betrothal between Kellen and his daughter, Lady Amara Voss, or he would consider the alliance dissolved entirely and begin exploring partnerships with rival kingdoms along the eastern border instead. Lady Vane called an emergency council session within the hour, and Kellen arrived to find the entire chamber already tense with anxious speculation. Maps of the eastern border spread across the central table, alongside reports detailing exactly how vulnerable that territory would become without House Draven's continued cooperation. "This is precisely the situation I warned you about," Lady Vane said, once the council had settled and the messenger's demands had been read aloud in full. "Lord Voss has waited patiently for 2 months, expecting a formal betrothal announcement that never came. He is not a man accustomed to being kept waiting, and if we do not act quickly, we risk losing an alliance this kingdom desperately needs, particularly given the increasing raids along our eastern territories over the past several seasons." "What exactly are you proposing?" Kellen asked, though he already suspected the answer, and the familiar dread of it settled heavy in his stomach. "I am proposing that you send word immediately accepting the betrothal," Lady Vane said. "A formal announcement, followed by a wedding within the season. It is the only way to secure the alliance before Lord Voss looks elsewhere, and frankly, Kellen, it is the arrangement we should have finalized months ago, before this entire situation with the servant girl complicated matters." Several council members murmured in agreement, and Kellen felt the weight of their collective expectation pressing down on him. The same suffocating pressure he had felt on the morning of his coronation, the same familiar voices insisting that duty required sacrifice, that a king's personal feelings must always yield to the greater needs of his kingdom. This time, however, he recognized the pattern for what it was, and he found himself able to step back from it with a clarity that surprised even himself. "I will not agree to a formal betrothal today," he said, and the chamber fell into startled silence at the firmness in his voice. "I understand the alliance matters. I understand the risk to our eastern border, if House Draven withdraws their support. But I will not repeat the mistake I made on my coronation morning, agreeing to something irreversible under pressure, without proper time to consider every option available to us." "There is no time for careful consideration," Lady Vane said, her voice sharpening with visible frustration. "Lord Voss has given us a matter of weeks, not months. If we delay, we lose the alliance entirely, and I fail to see what other option exists that would satisfy both the political necessity and your apparent reluctance to marry where duty requires." Kellen considered this for a long moment, his mind working through the problem with a focus he had not possessed 2 months earlier, back when he would have simply deferred to whichever advisor spoke most forcefully. "Send a formal response to Lord Voss," he said finally, "proposing an alliance built on trade agreements and mutual defense pacts, rather than marriage. Offer him preferential terms on the southern trade routes, terms generous enough to demonstrate our genuine commitment to the partnership without requiring a betrothal that neither party may truly want." Lord Voss specifically requested a marriage alliance, Lady Vane pointed out. "He will see a trade proposal as a rejection, an insult to his daughter and his house. Then I will travel to House Draven personally, and explain my reasoning directly, Kellen said. I would rather risk his displeasure by being honest about my circumstances than bind myself and his daughter to a marriage built on nothing but political convenience, particularly when I already carry an unresolved bond to another woman that I have no intention of abandoning permanently. The chamber erupted into a flurry of concerned discussion at this open acknowledgement, several council members exchanging alarmed glances, but Kellen held his ground through all of it, answering each objection with the same steady conviction, until finally, exhausted by his unwavering resolve, the council agreed to draft the alternative proposal for Lord Voss, with Kellen himself planning to travel to House Draven within the week to deliver it in person and negotiate whatever terms might be necessary to preserve the alliance, without a marriage neither he, nor, he suspected, Lady Amara actually wanted. Word of the confrontation reached Wren by that evening, as such things always did, though this time the report came not through casual servant gossip, but through Della, who had heard it directly from a council attendant and hurried to find Wren in the herb gardens with visible excitement. He refused the betrothal, Della said, slightly breathless from her hurried walk across the castle grounds. Right there in front of the whole council, he told them he would not marry Lady Amara, not while there was unfinished business with you standing in the way. Wren set down the basket of herbs she had been sorting, processing this news with a complicated swirl of emotions she was not entirely prepared to examine. He said that? In front of the entire council? Every word of it, according to what I heard, Della confirmed. Lady Vane looked ready to combust on the spot, but he would not budge. He is riding out to House Draven himself within the week to sort out some other arrangement, something about trade agreements instead of marriage. Wren stood quietly for a long moment after Della hurried off to spread the news further, staring at the herb beds without really seeing them, her mind racing through everything this new development might mean. She had spent the past 2 months carefully guarding herself against exactly this kind of hope, reminding herself repeatedly that Kellen's gentle words in the garden and his quiet acts of consideration, however genuine they seemed in the moment, could still crumble the instant real political pressure returned to test them. But this was real pressure, precisely the kind of situation that had led him to reject her so easily on the morning of his coronation, and this time he had not folded. He had stood in front of his entire council, faced down Lady Vane's considerable influence, and refused an arrangement that would have permanently severed any possibility of a future between them, all without knowing whether Wren herself would ever be willing to offer him that future in return. That evening, she found him in the castle's small private chapel, a place he had taken to visiting occasionally in recent weeks when he needed quiet space to think, and she stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him kneel before the simple stone altar with his head bowed, before finally stepping inside. He looked up at the sound of her footsteps, visible surprise crossing his face, quickly followed by something more cautious, as though he were bracing himself for whatever reaction she had come to deliver. I heard about the council meeting, Wren said, settling onto the bench beside where he knelt, though careful to maintain some distance between them. I imagine everyone in the castle has heard by now, Kellen said, a tired but genuine smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Lady Vane made certain her displeasure was thoroughly witnessed. Why did you refuse? Wren asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer, needing to hear him articulate it directly all the same. Kellen considered the question seriously before answering, choosing his words with obvious care. Because I made a promise to myself, after the morning I rejected you, that I would never again let political convenience override what I actually believed was right, or what I actually wanted for my own life. Marrying Lady Amara might have secured the eastern border more quickly, and I understand the risk I am taking by pursuing a different path. But I could not bind myself to another woman, while there remained even a small possibility that you and I might find our way back to each other. That would not have been fair to Lady Amara, and it certainly would not have been fair to you, or to whatever remains of the bond between us. Wren felt her carefully maintained composure finally begin to crack, not from sadness this time, but from something warmer, something she had been resisting for weeks, out of fear that hoping too openly might only lead to further disappointment. You are taking an enormous risk, she said. If House Draven withdraws entirely, if the eastern border suffers because of this decision, the council will hold you responsible. Lady Vane will make certain everyone remembers exactly why you made this choice. I am aware of the risk, Kellen said quietly. I have weighed it carefully, more carefully than I weighed anything on the morning of my coronation, and I have decided it is a risk I am willing to accept. Not because I am certain you will ever forgive me fully, or that we will ever find our way back to what the bond promised us that first morning. I am willing to accept it because I have finally understood that trying to build a kingdom, or a life, on decisions made purely out of fear and convenience, will never lead anywhere worth reaching. I would rather fail while trying to do right by the people I actually care about than succeed by continuing to betray them. Ren reached out, almost without deciding to, and took his hand where it rested on the edge of the altar. The contact sent the familiar warmth crackling between them, softer now than it had been in the throne hall weeks earlier, but unmistakably present, unmistakably alive despite everything that had tried to sever it. I am not offering forgiveness tonight, she said softly, but I am offering this. I believe you, Kellen. For the first time since the coronation, I truly believe you mean what you say. It was not everything, and both of them understood that clearly. But it was. They each recognized in that quiet chapel with the candles flickering low around them, more than either had dared to hope for only a few short weeks earlier, and it was enough, for now, to carry them forward into whatever difficult negotiations and uncertain outcomes still waited ahead. Kellen's journey to House Draven took 11 days, and every single one of those days felt to Ren like a small eternity, though she kept herself busy overseeing the herb gardens and food stores with a diligence that surprised even Della, who suspected, correctly, that the extra effort was as much about distracting herself from worry as it was about genuine dedication to her new role. The reports that trickled back to the castle during those 11 days were sparse and often contradictory, filtered through layers of messengers and second-hand accounts that left everyone, including Lady Vane, uncertain exactly how the negotiations were proceeding. Some reports suggested Lord Voss had received Kellen's alternative proposal with barely contained fury, insulted by what he perceived as a rejection of his daughter. Other reports suggested the two men had found unexpected common ground once Kellen explained his circumstances honestly, rather than hiding behind diplomatic evasion. Ren tried not to let herself hope too strongly in either direction, mindful of how quickly hope could curdle into fresh disappointment if things went badly. But despite her best efforts at emotional caution, she found herself watching the castle gates each evening as the sun set, waiting for some sign of Kellen's return, and she was not the only one. Della had taken to joining her on these evening watches, ostensibly to help with the final rounds of garden work, but really, Ren suspected, to offer quiet company through the anxious waiting. On the 12th day, a rider finally appeared on the road leading up to the castle, moving at a hard gallop that immediately drew attention from the guards stationed along the outer wall. Word spread quickly that the king's party had been sighted, and by the time Kellen actually rode through the main gates an hour later, a small crowd of castle staff and nobles had gathered in the courtyard, eager to learn the outcome of his journey. He looked exhausted, his traveling clothes dusty from the road, dark circles beneath his eyes suggesting he had slept little during the long ride home. But there was something steady in his bearing as he dismounted, something that suggested, whatever difficulties he had faced during the negotiations, he had not returned defeated. Lady Vane reached him first, her expression tight with barely contained anxiety. "Well?" she demanded, foregoing all pretense of formal greeting. "What is the outcome?" "Lord Voss has agreed to the trade proposal," Kellen said, and a visible wave of relief rippled through the gathered crowd. "It took considerable negotiation, and I will admit, there were moments when I feared we would leave without any agreement at all. But once I explained my circumstances honestly, without pretending the marriage proposal was ever truly about mutual affection, rather than political convenience, he seemed to respect the candor more than I expected. We have secured preferential trade terms along the southern routes, along with a mutual defense pact for the eastern border that he believes will serve his interests just as well as a marriage alliance would have." "And Lady Amara?" someone in the crowd asked, curious about the fate of the young noblewoman who had so nearly been bound to a marriage she likely had no more interest in than Kellen did. She seemed, if I am reading her correctly, considerably relieved by the outcome, Kellen said, a small, tired smile crossing his face. I believe she had her own reasons for preferring a different path forward, reasons she was gracious enough to share with me privately, though I will not betray her confidence by repeating them here. Lady Vane studied Kellen for a long moment, and something in her rigid posture finally began to ease, the tension of the past 2 weeks visibly draining from her shoulders. "You took an enormous risk," she said, though her voice had lost most of its earlier sharpness. "I want you to understand that I still believe it was reckless, gambling this kingdom's security on your ability to charm Lord Voss into an alternative arrangement, but I will admit, reluctantly, that the outcome has proven better than I expected." "I understand your concerns," Kellen said. "I do not fault you for them. You have spent years protecting this kingdom's interests, and I know my decision put considerable strain on that work. But I hope you can also understand why I could not proceed with a marriage that would have required me to abandon something I had already begun trying to repair." Lady Vane's gaze flicked briefly toward the edge of the crowd, where Wren stood watching the exchange with careful attention, and something complicated passed across the older woman's face. Not quite approval, but perhaps, for the first time, a grudging acknowledgement that her king's stubbornness on this particular matter might not have been entirely misguided after all. "We will discuss the full terms of the agreement tomorrow, once you have rested," she said finally, and with that, she turned and made her way back toward the castle, leaving Kellen standing in the courtyard, as the crowd gradually began to disperse around him. He found Wren waiting near the edge of the gathering once most of the onlookers had returned to their duties, and he crossed the remaining distance between them with visible relief, as though her presence there, waiting for him, was the thing he had been most anxious to confirm throughout the entire long journey home. "You waited," he said. "I heard the reports," Wren said. "I wanted to see for myself how things had actually gone, rather than relying on second-hand gossip that changed with every retelling. And what do you think, now that you have heard it directly?" Kellen asked, studying her face with careful attention, searching for some sign of what she felt about everything that had happened. Wren considered the question seriously, aware that her answer carried significant weight, that this moment represented something like a genuine turning point in whatever remained possible between them. "I think," she said slowly, "that you kept a promise you had no obligation to keep, at considerable personal and political risk, and that you did it without knowing whether I would ever be willing to offer you anything in return. That matters to me, Kellen. It matters more than I expected it to." "I did not do it expecting anything in return," Kellen said honestly. "I did it because it was the right choice, regardless of what happens between us going forward. But I will not pretend I did not hope, throughout every difficult moment of those negotiations, that succeeding might bring me closer to earning back some measure of your trust." Wren studied him for a long moment in the fading evening light, taking in the exhaustion evident in his posture, the dust still clinging to his traveling clothes, the steady conviction that had clearly carried him through 11 difficult days of negotiation with a man who had every reason to feel insulted by the outcome. She thought about the frightened, easily swayed king who had rejected her so carelessly on his coronation morning, and she compared him, without meaning to the man standing before her now, who had just spent nearly 2 weeks risking his kingdom's security rather than abandon the possibility of repairing what he had broken. "I am not offering you everything tonight," she said finally. "There is still healing that needs to happen, on my part as much as yours. But I would like to spend more time with you, Kellen, openly this time, without the careful distance we have maintained these past weeks. I think we have both earned the chance to find out what might actually be possible between us, if we are willing to keep trying." Relief and something warmer flooded across Kellen's face, and he reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wished, before gently taking her hand in his. The contact sent the now familiar warmth crackling between them, stronger this time, more settled, as though the bond itself recognized that something fundamental had shifted between them at last. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for giving me this chance, even after everything." "Do not thank me yet," Wren said, though a small smile had finally broken through her careful composure. "You still have a great deal of proving left to do. This is only the beginning, Kellen, not the resolution." "I understand," he said, "and I intend to spend however long it takes, proving myself worthy of whatever you are willing to offer, one honest day at a time." They walked back toward the castle together, as the last light faded from the sky, not yet fully reconciled, not yet free of everything that had happened between them, but moving forward at last in the same direction, side by side, toward whatever future they might still manage to build from the wreckage of that terrible coronation morning. 6 months passed between that evening in the courtyard and the day the entire kingdom gathered for the Autumn Harvest Festival, and during those months, Kellen and Wren built something slow and careful between them, a partnership that grew stronger not through grand declarations, but through the steady accumulation of small, consistent choices. He continued to seek her counsel on matters both large and small, valuing her perspective as someone who understood the daily struggles of the kingdom's common people in ways his noble advisors never could. She continued to guard her heart with reasonable caution, though the walls she had built around herself in the weeks following the rejection had, gradually, and almost imperceptibly, begun to soften. The bond between them had settled into something steadier during those months, no longer the raw, aching wound it had been in the immediate aftermath of the rejection, but not yet the full, easy connection either of them privately hoped it might someday become. It existed instead in a kind of patient middle ground, present and undeniable, but tempered by the genuine trust that could only be built through time and repeated demonstration, never simply granted through wishful thinking alone. The Harvest Festival had always been the largest celebration of the year in the kingdom, drawing common folk and nobility alike into the castle grounds for a full day of feasting, music, and tradition. This year, Kellen had insisted on expanding the celebration to include the outlying villages more fully than previous festivals had managed, a decision that had won him considerable goodwill among the very farming communities Lady Vane had once proposed taxing more heavily to fund border garrisons. Wren stood near the edge of the main courtyard as the festival reached its evening height, watching lanterns being lit throughout the grounds, watching children chase each other between the market stalls that had been set up for the occasion, and she felt, for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, a genuine sense of peace settle over her chest. Kellen found her there as the musicians began tuning their instruments for the evening's dancing, and he approached with a nervous energy that immediately caught her attention, so different from the calm, steady confidence he had cultivated over the preceding months. "You seem unusually tense for a man enjoying his own harvest festival," Wren observed, studying his fidgeting hands with amused curiosity. "I have something I wish to say," Kellen said, "and I find myself, despite everything I have learned about courage these past 6 months, considerably more nervous than I expected to be." Before Wren could respond, she noticed that the courtyard around them had grown quieter, that people had begun turning to watch, and she realized with a start that Kellen had apparently arranged for this moment to happen in full view of the gathered crowd, a deliberate choice that echoed, quite intentionally, the public nature of the rejection that had started everything 6 months earlier. "6 months ago," Kellen said, his voice carrying clearly across the now attentive courtyard, "I stood in my throne hall and rejected the bond fate had given me, in front of this entire court, because I was too afraid to stand against pressure I should never have yielded to. I hurt someone who deserved far better than the coward I was that morning, and I have spent every day since trying to become someone worthy of a second chance I had absolutely no right to expect." Wren felt her breath catch, understanding immediately what was happening, watching as Kellen lowered himself deliberately onto one knee before her, in the same courtyard where the entire castle had once witnessed her humiliation, now witnessing something entirely different unfold. "I am not asking you to forget what happened," Kellen continued, his voice steady despite the visible emotion behind his words. "I am not even asking, tonight, for a final answer about our future together. I am asking only for the chance to formally and publicly reverse what I did that morning, to declare before this entire kingdom that Wren Sorensen is my mate, that I claim the bond fully and without reservation, and that I will spend the rest of my life proving myself worthy of it, one honest day at a time, exactly as I promised you 6 months ago." The courtyard had fallen into complete silence, every person present holding their breath as they waited for Wren's response, and she found herself, in that moment, thinking not about the pain of the rejection or the careful walls she had maintained for so long, but about everything Kellen had done in the months since, every difficult choice, every moment of standing firm against pressure that would have been so much easier to simply yield to. She thought about the way he had refused the betrothal to Lady Amara, about the 11 anxious days she had spent waiting for news from House Draven, about the countless smaller moments of consideration and honesty that had gradually rebuilt the trust his rejection had once shattered so completely. None of it erased the pain of that first morning, and she understood, even now, that some faint scar of it would likely remain with her always. But scars, she had come to understand over these past months, did not have to define everything that came after them. "You hurt me terribly that morning," she said, her voice carrying across the silent courtyard, with a clarity that surprised even her. "I will not pretend that pain simply disappeared, because you have spent 6 months trying to make amends for it. But I have watched you change, Kellen, not through grand gestures meant to win me over in a single moment, but through hundreds of small, consistent choices that showed me, again and again, that you meant what you said in that garden all those months ago. You have earned this chance, not because you deserve automatic forgiveness for what happened, but because you have shown me, through sustained effort, exactly the kind of man you are capable of being." She reached down and took his hand, drawing him back to his feet, and the crowd around them released a collective breath, sensing that whatever answer was coming, it would not be the rejection some had perhaps feared. "I accept the bond," she said, and her voice, though not loud, carried through the still courtyard with unmistakable clarity, fully and without reservation, not because fate demands it, but because I have chosen it, freely, with clear eyes and full knowledge of everything that came before this moment. The courtyard erupted into cheering, and Kellen pulled her close, the bond between them flaring to full, brilliant life in a way neither of them had experienced since that very first moment in the throne hall. Though this time the connection felt entirely different, built now on genuine trust rather than simple fated recognition alone. Lanterns glowed warmly around them, musicians struck up a celebratory tune, and throughout the gathered crowd, servants and nobles alike raised their voices in genuine celebration, delighted to witness their king finally making right the wrong that had shadowed the earliest days of his reign. Della, watching from near the edge of the crowd with tears openly streaming down her weathered face, turned to the servant girl standing beside her and shook her head with a fond, exasperated smile. "I told you," she said. "Kings, you never can predict what they will do, but sometimes, just sometimes, they manage to surprise you in the best possible way." Later that evening, as the festival continued around them with music and dancing and the warm glow of countless lanterns lighting up the castle grounds, Kellen and Ren stood together near the same fountain where their quiet reconciliation had first begun months earlier, watching the celebration unfold before them. "Are you happy?" Kellen asked quietly, studying her face in the flickering lantern light. Ren considered the question seriously, thinking back over everything that had happened since that terrible coronation morning, the pain and the slow, careful rebuilding, the uncertainty and the eventual, hard-won trust that had brought them to this moment. "I am," she said finally, and she meant it completely, without reservation, not because everything that happened before this moment simply disappeared, but because we built something real out of the wreckage, something stronger, I think, than what we might have had if that first morning had gone differently. You know now, in a way you might never have learned otherwise, exactly what it costs to break a bond, and exactly what it takes to rebuild one. That knowledge will serve you well, I think, for the rest of your reign." Kellen smiled, pulling her closer as the music swelled around them, and for the first time since he had first felt that overwhelming pull toward her in his throne hall, so many months earlier, he felt no fear at all about the bond connecting them, only a deep and settled gratitude for the chance to finally, truly, deserve it. The kingdom continued to flourish in the years that followed, strengthened by trade agreements that proved more durable than any hasty marriage alliance might have been, and guided by a king who had learned, through painful experience, that true strength lay not in yielding to pressure, but in standing firm for what was genuinely right, even when doing so demanded real personal sacrifice. And throughout it all, Ren remained steadily by his side, not simply as his mate, but as his most trusted counselor, his equal partner in every meaningful sense, proof that even the deepest wounds, given enough honest effort and sustained patience, could eventually heal into something stronger than they had ever been before.